friends are synths.
If you'll forgive my mediocre piano playing there, today I am going to have the pleasure of talking to you about the Hydrasynth Explorer from ASM. The Explorer is a cut-down version of ASM's flagship Hydrasynth keyboard, an instrument which has gotten a lot of attention and praise for its really capable, deep sound engine and expressive possibilities. Now, I called the Explorer a cut-down version of the Hydrasynth keyboard there, but really that doesn't do it justice at all, because inside here there is a full 8-voice Hydrasynth sound engine. It just comes in this physically smaller form factor, and also for a significantly reduced price. Unlike the desktop version, this still has a keybed with Polyphonic Aftertouch, even though it's smaller than the big Hydrasynth keyboard, and that is an all-important element of this synthesizer, I think, which makes this a very interesting proposition indeed. Now, this particular Explorer was sent to me to try out by the folks at ASM, partly because I was talking to them and told them that this isn't actually my usual kind of synthesizer, in the sense that I think that modern digital synths like this, which have loads and loads of possibilities, can often seem dead overwhelming because it isn't always obvious how all the different bits work together and how you'd actually make music with it. A lot of the reviews and features talk about all of the technical mumbo-jumbo and the bits and, bits you can root here and there and everything, but it doesn't really capture how I would use the thing. And so I wanted to try it out for myself and see how it worked in practice and maybe how it fit into my studio and kind of how I make music. So that's what this is going to be about. At first, I do have to be honest and say that the buttons on the front of this thing were pretty intimidating actually, but in practice, it's not quite what I've expected, and I've been very pleasantly surprised. I've been using this for the past month or so and making different bits and pieces of music with it. So I'm going to share with you my thoughts on it. It's not going to be an in-depth feature run through, it's going to be kind of a real-world musician's, I guess I should say a very average musician's take on what is a really interesting synthesizer. Now, the first kind of things to talk about, I guess, are the build quality and the features. And I have to say that generally speaking, the build quality in this is very, very nice indeed. The case itself is plastic, but very tough. It doesn't feel cheap in the slightest. It's got a metal bottom on it, which adds to the heft. And the interesting thing is that you can power this on batteries. I think it's something like 8 or 6 AA batteries, which is kind of wild. But one of the things that you find with battery-powered devices is that they often rely on the batteries for, a bit of bulk and weight to the case. But that isn't the case here. This feels nice and solid as is without the batteries in there. So an interesting thing to note. In terms of all the wee bits and pieces like the knobs and the buttons and everything has a nice quality feel to it. The knobs have got a really nice resistance to them. These buttons are rubbery but feel really satisfying to press. And in general, the whole thing is just nice to interact with. One of the cool things that I like about this is we have a dual screen setup, and at first when I was watching some reviews I didn't really understand what the purpose of that was. However, down here we have the patch kind of information in terms of the waveform that's playing. So for example, and this is really useful, especially with the Polyphonic Aftertouch that I'll come on to explain a wee bit more in a wee bit of time. But you can see there the actual thing that's being played, which I think is really useful and something that more synthesizers should have, especially complex synthesizers like this one. Up here you have a whole bunch of different parameters that you can change on the particular patch. So whether it's the waveform, the chorus, the effects, or whatever it is, and it's actually quite an easy thing to get used to using. I didn't really read the manual at all when I first got this, and I was able to start using it straight away. Now down here you can see there's a whole host of different buttons, and these are the ones that I said were a bit intimidating at first. However, these give you really easy and quick access to different parameters. So we have different buttons for the different LFOs that are available. We have different buttons for, say, different filter types, and you can see on the relevant screens that we get information about them, which means that even though this is quite a deep synthesizer, these buttons really give you quick access into quite a lot of different parameters that otherwise might be hidden behind lots of menu diving and things like that. So this is a really nice touch as well. Now, something that I really like about the buttons, and actually just like about this synth in general, is you get a lot of visual feedback when you're making your music. So it's not just a case of having the waveforms here, even though I really like that. It's also a case of when these different parameters are engaged, the buttons light up accordingly. So if I play something, you'll see that the different parameters that are active at that particular point react in time, which is really nice because then you get some visual indication of what's going on in your patch. And this also applies to things like the color on this big click encoder here. You'll see that it changes color as we go through the patches. And that's just another wee nice touch that I think really helps kind of engage you and bring you into interacting with this thing. Now, in terms of the key bed, this is a semi-weighted key bed with many keys. So if you've got freakishly large hands, which I do not, then this might not be for you. However, it is similar in size to the one in the Arturia KeyStep Pro. I am not an expert in key beds, however, everyone I've spoken to has said that this is a really nice one, much nicer than normal mini keys, and to be honest, it feels perfectly nice to use to me. The important thing about the key bed, as I mentioned earlier, is that this is Polyphonic Aftertouch, and again, I'm going to go into talking about that a wee bit more shortly, so we'll come to that in a minute. In terms of connectivity, on the rear we have a whole bunch of different connections. We have a big chunky USB connection, which is for MIDI only, not for power. It's worth pointing that out. For power, we do have a separate DC input. Of course, you can use the batteries if you want to. We also have full-size MIDI DIN jacks, that is in and out, so none of the wee horrible mini MIDI DIN things that I hate. We've also got a sustain pedal input, which is on 1/4" jack. We've got a mono and stereo jack output, so we've got a single mono and then another mono jack output, which when combined make a stereo jack output. We've got a headphone jack output, which is a full-size 1/4" jack, it's not the mini jack. And then we have 5 CV and gate outputs, which you can use for clock, modulation, gate and pitch, which is really quite a nice addition. Now, one final thing that I really love about this is that it's got a Kensington lock on it. And if you don't know what that is, basically there's this old technology you used to find in laptops and stuff, where if you had to go to the toilet, for example, when you were DJing, or maybe you were in a university library and you couldn't be bothered taking your laptop or decks with you to the toilet, then you could lock your computer or whatever it might be onto a table using basically what was a glorified bike lock. And these have kind of fallen out of favour, but I think they're genius. They're really, really useful for live performance and a whole host of other things. So it's nice to see that you can connect up a Kensington lock to this. Well played, ASM. Now, this synthesizer is really deep, and it is so fully featured and interesting and kind of expressive that even though I've spent about a month or so playing with it, there's still tons of areas that I've yet to explore and make full use of. However, there are some things that I really love about it as an instrument which kind of transcend the depths, and so I'm going to kind of share some of them with you just now. The first thing that I really love is that this is an 8-voice synthesizer with 3 oscillators per voice. Now, this is a digital synthesizer, which means it's never going to sound like some big analog polyphonic synth. But to me, with those 3 oscillators per voice, it sounds particularly chunky. And other people might disagree, but I have listened to and played with a whole variety of digital synthesizers, and honestly, this has a sound to it that I think is much fuller than you might expect. And if it doesn't sound as full as you might expect, then you might need to go in and engage some of the different oscillator types, or bring up the volume on some of the particular oscillators, or change the modulation. That's the nature of this. Some of the presets will sound thinner than others because they are by their design. Now, moving on to Polyphonic Aftertouch, because this is one of the most important things about this synth that makes it really stand out and really interesting. Polyphonic Aftertouch, if you're not familiar with it, allows you to control the modulation of individual notes or keys based on the pressure that you place on the key, not just the velocity. So for example, by pressing a little bit harder or releasing the pressure a little bit after you press down the key, you can get different effects depending on how the modulation is routed. So for example, you could assign the filter cutoff to Polyphonic Aftertouch, or some of the many other parameters that are available. Now, I am not really a keys player, But I love this because it gives you the opportunity to very subtly or more drastically change the modulation by just pressing a bit harder on the keys, and can make a really kind of dull synthesizer patch turn into a really interesting one where you just very briefly change the pressure on the key. And this is something that can be really hard to do with a standard synth where you have to tweak a knob or whatever it might be. To give you an example of this, I've pulled up just a generic patch that's on here, one of the presets, and you'll see that if I just press down with kind of normal pressure, we get that kind of sound. But if I press down and then increase the pressure, and I can vary that, and it works per key. And I mean, that just sounds fantastic. And as I mentioned about the dual screen, this is where this comes in even more handy, because if you want to know what's going on when you're pressing down on the keys, you can see the screen reacting to the pressure. And it's just a fantastic way to kind of understand a bit more what's going on with your Polyphonic Aftertouch. Now, Polyphonic Aftertouch on this synthesizer alone is cool enough. However, as an added bonus, what I've discovered is that you can send out that Polyphonic Aftertouch data over MIDI. And this means you can use this as a MIDI controller that also has Polyphonic Aftertouch capabilities, which is no kind of mean feat. Those kind of controllers are fairly expensive and there's not too many of them out there. Now, I tested this on my Mac. I sent out the Polyphonic Aftertouch data over USB MIDI, and I sent it into my Arturia V Suite. It's the current collection and it's the CS80 V3. And if you know anything about the CS80, you'll know that one of the beautiful things about it was the ability to have or use Polyphonic Aftertouch to get really expressive with all of the possibilities in there. And if you combine this with the CS80 V3 VST, all of a sudden you get much closer to the sound and the feeling of a real CS80, which can be really hard to do otherwise within software. So that's a really nice added bonus that I didn't expect at all. Now, one other way that the ASM Hydrasynth offers expanded possibilities for expression is in its support for MPE. MPE is a protocol that kind of expands upon MIDI and allows you to use more advanced controllers like the Linstrument to get even more control and expressiveness over individual notes. So for example, you can change the pitch bend for individual notes by moving or gesticulating in a particular manner on the Linstrument. And this just offers up and opens up, I guess, a whole different world of interaction with the instrument, which is really quite exciting because there aren't a huge number of synthesizers out there that support MPE, and there's definitely not very many hardware synthesizers that do, so it's really cool to see that in here too. Now, hopefully by this point you're understanding that there are so many features in here that it isn't really possible to talk about or even touch upon all of them in this short video. For example, I haven't even mentioned the arpeggiator or the really capable mod matrix, and at some point I'll do some other videos talking about different elements like that. However, for now, the final thing that I want to highlight as a really key and interesting feature for me at least is that if, like myself, you happen to be a bit of a preset surfer and you don't really love creating your own patches from scratch or anything like that, you can make use of this button here, which is the random button. Now, the cool thing about the random button is not just that you can create kind of completely new patches with every parameter randomized, but you can also randomize individual parts of any one patch. So for example, at the moment I've got this sound. And let's say I wanted to randomize particular elements of it, but keep the kind of core, basis of that sound. I could hold random, I can then select the parameter that I want to change. For example, I don't know, let's change that filter. Do that. And you can hear that everything remains the same apart from the filter type that I've randomized. Change it again. Maybe change it again, change that one. But this extends to the reverb. Delay. And basically every other parameter that you can see there, which is such a cool way to take a sound that you quite like but want to change up a wee bit. So I'm a big fan of this button. So to sum up, this synthesizer is incredibly powerful, there's no doubt about that. You can see that it's got pre-effects, it's got post-effects, it's got a mod matrix, it's got an arpeggiator, it's got polyphonic aftertouch, it's got a huge amount of different parameters that you can vary and modulate, but it's also surprisingly easy to use. The way everything is laid out is really clear and you can pick it up just from, pressing buttons and seeing what happens, especially because of these nice and very well thought out displays. As I mentioned, I didn't even read the manual in the first few days, but I still managed to pick things up. Ultimately, this is a synthesizer that is designed to be played. With the polyphonic aftertouch, you get that wonderful expressive ability, but you can also use it as a sound module using something like a instrument, an MPE, or you can use MIDI CCs or NRPN. All of it just gives you a whole host of different possibilities. But I do have to say that as somebody who usually likes to use sequencers and stuff, I've found myself drawn to playing the keybed of this thing because it just gives you so much kind of natural way of playing with it. You wouldn't get that kind of feeling from a sequencer, and I love that. In many ways, this is the most economical way to get the capabilities of a Hydrasynth as well as the expressiveness of the keyboard, and I think you can even find it cheaper than the desktop version at the moment if you look around. As I mentioned at the start of the video, this kind of modern digital synthesizer with loads of different options for sound shaping would not normally be the kind of thing I would go for. However, over the past 6 weeks or so, I've found myself continually coming back to it when I'm making music, just because of the combination of the expressiveness of the polyphonic aftertouch, the depth of the sound engine, but also the ease of access to the various parameters, the way you can quickly change things with this random button, and also the visual feedback you get of the waveforms as you're playing. It's just a really fantastic combination, and I say that in all complete honesty and authenticity. I really, really like this synth. If you happen to be in the market for something that's a bit more expressive, or maybe you want a bit more depth of modulation possibilities, but you don't want to go for the really big full-sized keyboard, and you have kind of a particular budget in mind, this is a really good option and something I would definitely consider, especially if you're kind of comparing this to other synthesizers that are in the same kind of bracket, like the Argon or the Cobalt or some of the other kind of more wavetable based synths. This one personally I think has a lot more to offer. So that's it, that's my kind of review of the Hydrasynth Explorer after about 6 weeks or so, and hopefully this is kind of informative or interesting in some way. I know this has not been a blow-by-blow feature thing, but I'm going to be doing a lot more videos with this over the coming while, so if there's particular things you're interested in, sling them in the comments below, tell me how terrible my piano playing it is, and all the rest of it. For now, thank you for watching, goodbye.